Hey guys, it's Drake and I'm here with an unscripted video, but that doesn't mean that it's not researched. I am so tired about talking about Jane Foster's Thor here and on Twitter, and I also hate doing these kind of debunked videos because I just feel like it's negative. However, there's misinformation being spread, and I feel like it's my obligation to actually chime in about it. I recently did a video that did pretty well talking about why I was a big fan of Jason Aaron's take on Jane Foster as Thor because I enjoyed his entire run from Thor God of Thunder all the way up to War of the Realms. However, there were a lot of people in my comment section claiming that the Jane Foster books sold poorly and that's why they were canceled. And I'm here to talk about that because one, they weren't canceled. It was always meant to be temporary. I mean, anybody who actually read the book could pretty easily tell that this was not meant to be an ongoing thing. They had to finish up the story so they could get to Thor Volume 5 to make the way for War of the Realms. So yeah, not canceled, at least as far as my research has been able to see. I understand that a lot of people think that whenever a book ends, that means it's canceled, but I see the term canceled being thrown around a lot by people who don't know much about the comic industry, especially for stuff like a miniseries ending, and that's just not accurate. But I do want to address the sales issue. People are saying that the Jane Foster Thor books sold super poorly, and that is just not the case. So I have here a bunch of sales data that I want to share with you guys about Thor Volume 4, which is when Jane Foster first took up the mantle. Now, all of this information comes from a website called Comicron, and this is a website that you see cited a whole lot when it comes to comic book sales data because they're kind of the only people that are tracking this. I will say though that this website is a bit of a flawed system because they are only tracking the sales that are sold to stores, not necessarily to customers. I have a lot of issues with the modern comic industry, and this is very indicative of them. So one of the things that's interesting is that because we're only using Comicron sales, that doesn't include digital sales, which a sizable amount of people are moving towards, especially young readers. We're living in the age where print media is dying, so strictly going off of physical sales is a little bit weird. However, it is useful to use Comicron when you're looking at larger trends, not necessarily for the exact minutia. Anyway, issue 1 of Thor Volume 4 sold 150,862 units, and that was the third best-selling comic of the month. Now, this is very standard when it comes to issue 1s. Those are going to be the best performing of all of them. A lot of people are still buying issue 1 strictly for the collector's value. Personally, I buy most of my comics digitally, and I do still buy the number 1 strictly for whenever I'm doing my live action set. I rotate out my comics all the time, but I'm not known to buy more than just the first issue. So issue 2 went down to 89,131 units. It was the 6th best-selling comic of the month. So yeah, we saw a pretty sizable difference, but it's still pretty common to see a big number like this for issue 2s. Now, when we get to issue 3 at 72,563 units, this is kind of where the rest of Thor Volume 4 stays. Issue 4, 69,000, issue 5, 69,000, issue 6, 70,000, issue 7, 72,000, and issue 8 at 86,000. The annual is the least selling of all of them with only 58,000, but that's not uncommon for annuals, and this was released on the same month as issue 5. Now, one thing that you're going to see here is that the absolute lowest that any of these books place in the total rankings was at the 17th best-selling comic of the month, and that was for the annual. So yeah, for Thor Volume 4, it never dipped below the 20th best-selling comic of the month when the issues were released. Now, unfortunately, that isn't enough for some people, like this guy in my comment section that said that we shouldn't be looking at monthly sales, but rather the yearly sales. And I'm going to admit, yeah, the Thor books didn't sell that much in the grand scope of things. If you look at 2014, which was when Thor Volume 4 came out, it did have 2 books that were in the top 100, but let's take a look at this list a little bit more. Of the entire American comic book industry, which is including indies, there were 38 titles that sold in the top 100. Now, of those, there were 6 series that had 2 or more books in the runnings. Spider-Man had Amazing, Superior, and 2099, Wolverine had the Standard Book and Death of Wolverine, Superman had the Standard Book and Superman Unchained, Avengers had the Standard and Avengers World, and Batman had the Standard Comic, Batman Eternal, and Detective Comics. Now, if you were to include Spider-Woman as a Spider-Man book, and Grayson and Harley Quinn as Batman books, that means that Spider-Man had 4 of the top 100 books in 2014, totaling in at 24 out of 100 issues, and Batman had 5 with 22 out of 100 issues. So out of the entire American comic industry, 2 franchises sold 46 out of the top 100 comics. That doesn't leave a whole lot of room for any other series to really shine. So that means that it's pretty impressive that the Jane Foster Thor books managed to have 2 out of that remainder. And yes, I will admit that this is from the very early issues of the book. These were the best selling out of the entire run. However, this is where things get a little bit tricky when it comes to Marvel Comics because they put all of their books on hiatus to make room for an event called Secret Wars. Instead of releasing all of their books, they stopped production on all of them and instead made a bunch of tie-ins for a good while, and that was That was hard. So coming back from Secret Wars, the first issue of the Mighty Thor, which is what Thor Volume 4 was renamed to, was a little bit buried with the other relaunches. Even though it was still the 9th best-selling comic of the month, it was below 5 new Marvel #1s, Uncanny X-Men number 600, which was essentially another #1 but with legacy numbering, an issue of Secret Wars itself, and the debut of the next installment of the Dark Knight Returns series. Now, issue 2 had the usual decline that comes with not being a #1, but again, it was buried by other new #1s, annuals, and specials. Not to mention that another Secret Wars was released, along with a massive increase of sales from DC Comics as their next big phase was being hyped up. Rebirth. Also, in a funny tidbit, this is finally what brought a Jane FosThor book below the top 20, which clocked in at 21. Now, I went ahead and went through the entirety of the Mighty Thor series, and I made 2 different graphs. One is for the total sales, and then one is for the market placement. You're gonna notice that even though, yes, there is the normal decline that comes with comics, literally every single one goes through it, they still kind of sold a pretty consistent amount of books through the entirety of it. But also, the market placement was all over the place. Because remember when I was mentioning that DC was launching Rebirth? Well, when they did, it started dominating the sales chart, and they were at the very top because all of their books were getting fresh relaunches. It was a lot of stuff that fans are begging for, and that means that all of Marvel's books started to decline as a result. Now, we did see a couple of spikes in the sales data, such as issue 15, which was also the same month that the Mighty Thor trade was released. This is actually pretty common because there's a lot of people that don't want to buy issue by issue. They do what's called trade waiting, where they wait for the trade. Typically, trades are going to be a lot cheaper than buying all the issues individually, and it's a lot more convenient for a lot of people. However, there are some people that decide to trade wait, and if they like the book so much, then they're more willing to be buying the current issues. So that is what that spike kind of explains. Now, there was another big spike with issue 700, and don't worry, there weren't a bunch of other comics that were released. This was instead Marvel deciding to go back to legacy numbering and make it a big deal. I'm personally not a fan of that, but you can kind of treat it like it's a brand new #1. And this also did make it the 2nd best-selling comic of the month. Now, the sales went right back down to where they were beforehand because this was from the same people who were reading the book prior, but this was also the marking of the final arc. They were going to finally kill off Jane FosThor so that Thor Odinson could get the hammer back to start paving the way towards War of the Realms and finally complete Jason Aaron's story that he had been telling since 2012. And although she did come back to life shortly after, in fact, it was kind of like she never died in the first place because she just simply didn't move on to the afterlife because comics, this is also pretty indicative of the market. Whenever there's a big event like this, especially with a character dying, you're going to see an uptick in sales. Now, throughout all of Jane's time as Thor, from Thor Volume 4 to Mighty Thor, the lowest that her book sold was 35,499 units. At the time of this recording, the most recent sales data that we have from comics is May 2019. At those units sold, this puts the lowest performing Jane book above some seemingly bigger characters like the Punisher, Iron Man, Shazam, Wonder Woman, Miles Morales, Daredevil, and Doctor Strange. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not going to sit here and try to pretend like the Mighty Thor series sold as well as Thor Volume 4, but I am confident in saying that Thor Volume 4 did sell well. It sold a lot better than a lot of people give it credit for. And unfortunately, I think that a lot of the people that are claiming that it didn't sell well really don't know that much about the comic industry, and it really seems like they're just parroting some of the information they heard online from haters. I'm a firm believer that you should always go and do the research yourself. That's why I never started defending the sales data of the Jane FosThor books until I went in and confirmed the data so I knew what I was talking about. Whenever you're just repeating information that you heard online, including from this channel, you run the risk of absorbing bias and human errors, which I am human. I might have made a mistake in this. I tried my best to not, but I wouldn't be surprised if I got some of my information wrong, which is why I encourage you to fact check me and let me know. I just don't think that you can actually have an argument in good faith unless you've done the research for yourself. Anyway, that's all I really have to say. I looked over the data, and it looks like that the Jane FosThor books actually sold pretty decently, all things considered. Especially when it went to the Mighty Thor stuff, it was very consistent across the board with a few spikes up for the bigger events. I am so tired of just having to talk about Jane FosThor. I want to do more with my life, but if you're not tired of hearing about it, then I have a big video explaining why I enjoyed that run in the first place. I went into a lot of the common criticisms, like, why was she getting the name Thor? Thor is the name of Thor Odinson. It's not a title that you can just pass down. And I explained a bit more of the nuances of things. So if that interests you and you haven't already watched it, maybe give that a watch. Anyway, I'm gonna try to edit this up, not edit to my normal standards, but yeah, I'll see you guys next time. Bye.